old ox a handful of month-old grass.
Let's
He
go,
spat it in my
people!
face and tried to carve me a new nipple. Nice stay with his drink.
Summer's coming soon, and soon the beating sun.
Gave the old ox a handful of month-old grass. He spat it in my face and tried to carve me a new nipple.
That axe really needs some sharpening. I think the window should go over there. I do hope we have enough wood to finish this building. Most embarrassing. We're not halfway through. Is this beam straight? Methinks it is, or at least straight enough for this kind of work. Fresh start for me and me own.
Summer's coming soon. And soon Summer's coming soon. Soon.
Good work, man!
Is this smooth enough? Can I stay where there's drink?
Summer's coming soon. And soon the beating sun. Time to find a good street. Soft.
Summer's coming soon, and soon the beating sun.
Good work, man.
Summer's coming soon, and soon the beating sun. Summer's coming soon, and soon the beating sun.
We all know what that means.
Time to find a good tree and soft ground. Summer's coming soon, and soon the beating sun. Can I stay where there's drink? Can I stay where there's drink?
Let's get to work.
No hobble. Tomorrow, find a new home. Or town. Bring this here, move that there, on and on. Summer's coming, and soon the beating sun.
There's no hovel. Tomorrow, find a new home. Or town. Summer's coming soon. Soon.
Come on, people. Get to work.
Gave the old ox a handful of month old grain. He spat it in my face and tried to carve me a new nipple.
If I have to spend another winter in Albrecht's barn, I'd like to freeze me balls off, even with his wife to keep me warm. coming up.
Determine who
Don't forget to check the level of the foundation.
were medieval peasants slaves, and was medieval serfdom effectively the same as slavery? The population of medieval England is actually quite hard to estimate. The Domesday Book, that fantastic document written by our Norman conquerors, Duke William of Normandy in 1086, catalogued a huge amount of the country in a vast amount of detail. It actually only mentions about 283,000 people, and it misses out some very big categories: women, children, the clergy. It doesn't talk about London in particular, and it misses out some parts of England as well, because it wasn't fully completed. So of that 283,000 men that are mentioned in the Domesday Book, we projected up to be something of the order of 2 million, 2.5 million people living in England in the medieval time. In the 11th century, most of the population lived in villages, in rural communities, and by most of the population I mean estimates vary between 90 to 95% of the population, leaving 5% of the population to live in the growing towns and cities. London was quite big, but by comparison to today, absolutely minuscule. What that means then is that the vast majority of the medieval population were peasants. Typically, peasants were divided into two broad categories. They were serfs or servile, or they were freemen or free. Well, what's the difference between a serf and a slave? Well, actually, quite a lot. A serf could be bought and sold, but as part of a piece of land. So the lord of the manor could buy and sell a parcel of land that would have you attached to it. But you had certain rights to that land, to farm and live there, and those couldn't be removed by the lord of the manor, which is a kind of form of buying and selling tenancies. Landlords today will buy a tenement building with a lot of people that have rights, that are living in it, and they get the rent.
There we go.
Same thing, really. So arguably, nothing much has changed there. Slaves, on the other hand, could be bought and sold as individual human beings for money, with no reference to a piece of land, nothing at all. Now, interestingly, in the Norman period, slavery seems to have been massively in decline. In fact, various bishops preached against it, and Bishop Anselm said in particular, it should be wrong to sell a man like a brute beast. So it appears that the Normans made significant efforts to actually destroy the trade in slavery that happened in the earlier medieval period. There was a slave trade between Bristol and Dublin. Dublin was actually set up by the Vikings specifically as a slave trading port. And Bristol, which became famous for the slave trade later on in history, was also partly responsible for dispatching slaves to various parts of the world back then in the medieval period. There were slaves mentioned in the Domesday Book. These are Englishmen whose social status is slave, but they're few and far between. The vast majority of farm workers are peasants, and they have rights. So it appears that the whole concept of slavery was dispatched and got rid of by the Normans. Admittedly, it was commuted to bonded servitude, if you like. Basically, it was Norman policy to free slaves, turn them into bonded servants, people who actually had to work the land for themselves, but give them rights. It's really fascinating to think that the Norman conquest brought with it one of the first emancipations of slaves in the Western world. a lord was not allowed to kill or maim his serf. He'd get into trouble for that, but he was allowed to tax him in lots of different ways. So, for example, when a serf died, the lord got to choose his best animal as a death duty. We still have death duties today in much of the Western world. He could tax him if he wanted to get married and perhaps partly control who he married and where he was going to live afterwards. And one of the ways that was particularly contentious was he could force him to use the lord's mill to mill his grain. Now, it's perfectly possible if you're a peasant to mill grain at home, but the lord could force you to mill the grain at his miller's mill, and the miller would often be a bit corrupt, would charge you 10%, and he would also charge you much more money than it would have cost you to do it yourself. So milling grain at the lord's mill was a source of revenue for the lord, but it was also a source of severe discontent amongst the peasantry. We do have a record of a lord being fined for thrashing. We don't know what thrashing means, but he was fined for thrashing his serf. He was fined 40 shillings, which is actually quite a large sum of money. Now, money's value is actually quite hard to determine by today's standards, but people were paid a penny or so for a day's work. So therefore, a shilling is many, many days' work. It's probably the equivalent to tens of thousands of pounds or dollars in today's currency. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, specifically says that a lord is not allowed to bring a villain to ruin. So he is specifically not allowed to confiscate his land or the tools of his trade. Which is interesting because that's very similar to modern day Western bankruptcy laws. You can take a lot of goods, but you can't take, usually, the tools of somebody's trade. The typical medieval peasant lived as part of a manor, and that manor would compose of 2 or 3 villages. They'd live there with their family on effectively their small holding, and they'd report to one lord. So one lord would have 2 or 3 villages to his name. That would obviously change. Some had fewer, some had many, many more. And if you were servile, you had to work 2 or 3 days a week for the lord of the manor on boon work. If you were free, you usually had to pay rent in terms of money, but sometimes you could do physical work for the lord. Of course, not everybody lived in the manorial system. There are big religious communities, and those are worked by people called lay brothers, who are not specifically clergy, but they were the ones doing all the physical labour in the religious institutions. There's a theoretical diagonal line that runs very roughly from northwest to southeast that divides England. The upper right bit was the Danelaw and was settled by waves of immigrants from Northern Europe, who were then called Danes, and were likely various different people. They had their own laws and customs, just to confuse things. In the area known as Danelaw, there are actually relatively few serfs recorded in the Domesday Book, which is interesting. And mostly free men, and mostly pay rent. And in some areas, particularly in Northumberland, for example, in the very north of England, there was a curious thing about thanes and drengs. And they actually paid tax based on the number of horned beasts they had, which is a complete hangover from the very earliest days
bring that piece
of
over
the
here.
medieval period. In the far south, in Kent, Edward Longshanks, Edward I, Malleus Scotorum, the hammer of the
Let's
Scots,
straighten this up.
specifically declared all Kentishmen be free. So there's a totally different organisation in the south of England and in the north of England, just to confuse things. We do have records of some of the highly detailed jobs
solid as a rock,
that
twice
the
as heavy.
medieval peasant was expected to do. The Black Book of Peterborough, which was made between 1125 and 1128,
We'll need to dig the
specifies
foundations
each
deeper
man
for
must
this
plough
one.
4 acres for the spring sowing, must work 3 days in each week, and must supply 60 hens and 640
Just
eggs
give me a
a
hammer
year.
and something
Very
needs to
specific.
not move.
The Knights Templar, yes, real Knights Templars did exist, and they ran religious institutions
I do hope we have enough
in
wood to finish
medieval
this
England.
building.
I'm
It's been
not
most
sure
embarrassing
whether
to
they
run
were
out halfway
hiding the
through.
Holy Grail or having all these sort of legendary adventures that later stories were to embellish. But they
Summer's
genuinely
coming
did
soon.
exist, and they genuinely
Soon.
wrote down rules for what people had to do on their land and when. There were specific phrases like, must mow 4 days a week until the meadows are cleared and the hay is carried in. It was also specified that they would have to carry loads to Gloucester, which was 20
No
miles
hobble.
away
Tomorrow,
from
brand
the
new home.
religious establishment, or wherever the master wills it. And they also needed to move the sheep
Summer's coming soon,
twice a year.
and soon the beating
So
sun.
the rules were written down in very very specific detail, and woe betide anybody that didn't actually follow them. Now, of particular interest, I think, is that as the medieval period goes on, a lot of the religious orders started to change the willingness to accept cash. And I think this is really because money is a bit more reusable than 4 days a week mowing and so. The actual cash could then be transported and moved abroad or moved to different parts of the world where it was specifically needed. Whereas having a bunch of blokes who have to specifically mow this specific field at this time of year is not as flexible as give me the money and I can do what I like with it. So as the medieval period goes on, we see a lot of transition from boon work, having to do certain things at certain times of the year, to paying money instead, even if you're servile. Here's another interesting little nugget in the records. We see some families that start out as free become servile. So it's possible to go the other way, and some people who started out servile become free. And it does appear that certain land came with servility. So it was possible, in some cases, to get more and better land if you were servile and sort of go down the social ladder, if you like, but have more land and better land and give up your freedom, and vice versa. So the situation, as always, is actually quite a lot more complex. We know that some people went to court to prove that they were servile or free, and often they were talking about whether their father was servile or free or not. And in some cases, the whole situation is muddied because free men married servile women and servile men married free women. And the courts had to determine what happens to that union, to that family group. Were they now servile or were they now free? As you can imagine with human beings, the situation is quite complicated. But just like today, status matters for some people, but not everybody. From the 10th century to the 12th century, the courts seem very keen to determine who is a serf or is servile and who's actually free. So how do you prove that you're free, or how does your Lord of the Manor prove that you're servile? Well, one of the definitions is terra ad furcum et flagellum, which is Latin for do you hold by fork and flail, which we think, and we're not sure, we think this means do you hold the land because of tasks you have to do for the Lord of the Manor, or do you actually pay him rent? Because the idea is if you broadly have to do work for the Lord of the Manor, you are servile, and if you pay money rent, then you're free. But of course, in life, it is never that simple, because most of the records indicate that people had a bit of both. They paid some money and they did some tasks. So the courts had to work out how servile or how free you might or might not be. Then, of course, as now, going to court was expensive. So it must have been a really important thing for people to have decided for them, or they must have wanted to prove that they were free as opposed to servile. We don't quite know why. Maybe it was a social thing. Maybe it was just a personal, I am free and I want to prove it and have the courts prove it. Maybe Lords of the Manor didn't want too many free people on their land. And maybe because you had a broadly less literate society, people didn't have the paperwork to prove what their status was. So forks and flails are important deciders as far as the court is concerned. If you are a villain, a serf, you're servile, how do you win your freedom? Well, there are several ways that can happen actually. The first one, and you might have guessed, you pay money to your lord in what's called quit rent. You pay him money and he declares you free. Now technically, all the money you owed had to be paid by a third person, because as a serf, you didn't actually own any of your own money, technically, although it's a bit more complex than that. Basically, you had to get a third person to pay the money to your lord. But the lord was probably quite happy to receive the money, declared you free. Sometimes there'd be a big ceremony associated with it, and we have records of the mayor of the town celebrating your freedom. So it was a big social event in some cases, and who knows why people wanted to become free. Maybe it was just a social status, Maybe it saved them taxes, we don't really know. But that's the main way people became free. There's another one. If you didn't have any money, you could run away. Yes, you could actually run away to the town. There's an expression in medieval England which is town air sets men free. And that's exactly what you had to do. You had to run away and live in the town undetected for a year and a day. Now, Lords of the Manor were often not very keen for this to happen, so they would send people in to capture you. But the towns were actually expanding rapidly at this time in history. They were quite keen to make sure you became free, because then you become a townsman and you would add to their power. So the towns usually turned either a blind eye to you being a runaway serf, or slightly helped you, kind of gave you nudges in the right direction, or certainly wouldn't have turned you in, because it's to their advantage if you become free. Thirdly, you take holy orders, because if you are a member of the clergy, you are exempt from ordinary rules. You have to follow church rules, and you would be tried in church courts, for example. And often the churches didn't have the death penalty. They sent you to some far away monastery to live the rest of your life if you're particularly bad. But basically the clergy were outside the serf-free kind of spectrum, if you like. So you could become a man of the cloth, follow God, and become free that way. And lastly, it is possible, but it's not really recorded very much in medieval manuscripts, but it is possible that good military service might have enabled you to win your freedom, if you like. And some of the evidence we have from that is William Shakespeare, post-medieval, but quite close to the medieval period. In Henry V, he says, "He who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile," i.e. he's a villain, servile. "Today shall gentle his condition. Today he shall become free." So in that statement, Henry V is specifically saying to the villeins or the servile people in his army that if you fight for me, you shed your blood, and we win, I will give you your freedom. You'll become a free man.
Summer's coming soon.
Whether that
Soon
happened
beating
in
summer.
history or not, we don't actually know, but I think it's quite likely. So if you fought for your country and did so well, there's a fair chance, if you did it well enough, you might become free. But it is an interesting representation of what Shakespeare, who was closer to the medieval period, thought might be the case. He could be making it up, but I think it's quite likely that if you gave good military service and you were a villain, why wouldn't your lords and masters make you free?
strip.
Bring this in, move that there. You'll not find finer wares anywhere else. Come along, lad. Gave the old ox a handful of month's old drag. He spat it in my face, tried to carve me a new nipple. We all know what that means, don't we? This is heavier than it looks.
Why do I have to carry this alone?
We all know what that means.
Come on, laddie.
not find finer wares anywhere else. Just give me a hammer and something needs to not move. I'll put it in its place. Don't be shy, good sirs and ladies. Just give me a hammer and something needs to not move. I'll put it in its place.
Let's get to
Bring
work.
this here, move that there, on.
Poor quality, you say? Impossible.
This is heavier than it looks.
Don't be shy, good sirs and ladies.
Why do I have to carry this alone?
Well, perhaps it was simply a bad batch. These things do happen from time to time.
Oh, this is heavier than it looks.
Another beam coming up.
We need to hoist this timber to the gable.
This is heavier than it looks. Cheated him? Never. Perhaps he simply does not know how to cook properly. come one, come all. Feast your eyes on our fine selection. Fresh meat. Get your fresh meat here. No finer cuts in all the land.
Come on.
He spat it in my face and tried to carve me a new nipple.
Come along, lad. Come on.
Let's go, people!
This is heavier than it looks. Bring this here, move that there.
Oh, this is heavier than it looks.
Why do I have to carry this along? Fresh meat.
the rafters already.
Give me a hammer and something needs to not move.
We'll need to dig the foundations deeper for this one.
Carry this a little.
this is heavier than it looks.
Why do I have to carry this alone? Why do I have to carry this alone? Bring this in, move that there. We all know what that means, don't we?
Why do I have to carry this alone? Whoa, this is heavier than it looks.
spat it in my face and tried to carve me a new nipple.
Gets rainy like this and the wife won't get out of bed. Says her head hurts. I tell her maybe screaming all the time wouldn't hurt. I wonder who's floating away today. Hasn't stopped since the morning.
Gave the old ox a handful of month-old grey. He spat it in my face and tried to carve me a new nipple. We all know what that means, huh?
a veritable masterpiece of carpentry. Solid as a rock, and twice as heavy.
Let's go, people!
Gets rainy like this in the wife when I get out of bed. Says her head hurts. I tell her maybe even screaming all the time wouldn't hurt. Doesn't listen though. Why do I have to carry this alone? Wood lice and rot. Nothing good. still work.